يسرنا أن أرحب بكم في الجلسة الأخيرة وإن شاء الله تكون مسك الختام، وهي جلسة حول بناء الدولة وديناميات التنافس الإقليمي في متحدثين بارزين في هذا الجانب.
Dynamics of regional rivalry, and we look forward. We have three panelists. We will start with Dr. William Thompson. He's a distinguished professor, Emeritus Rogers Chair, and the chair of Oxford Encyclopedia and Politics. He will be talking about the GCC countries, and also will be talking about Iran and Iraq, and he will analyze data issued from the IMF regarding general indications about the Gulf countries and the development of political situation. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you for the invitation to come, and I am very cognizant of the burden of being in the last panel. The best approach to being in the last panel is to say, let's forget about it, everybody go and leave right away. I understand that, but we probably can't get away with that. My paper is about state making in the Gulf, and it's a little bit differently structured than some of the papers that I've heard here today. I have data and models and variables and that sort of thing, but I left the PowerPoints at home, and I'll try and get through them as quickly as I can, trying to describe the figures and the outcomes with my fingers in the air instead of on a screen. If you look at a newspaper any day in the last couple of months, you will have seen a number of different things going on in this general area that all pertain to state making. It's something that goes on constantly. It's something all states do. It's not a development issue. Old states, new states, rich states, poor states, all engaged in state making and shaping and reconfiguring what it is that their institutions are supposed to do. In this particular neighborhood that we're in right now, you are aware of an embargo against Qatar. But there are other things going on, like an anti-corruption drive in Saudi Arabia that happens to liberate, quote unquote, both the Navy and the National Guard for central control along the way. There's a Lebanese prime minister who resigned in Saudi Arabia and then was questionable whether he could leave Saudi Arabia for a while, but he eventually ended up back in Beirut, again as prime minister. You have Kurds attempting to secede in Iraq. Kuwaiti parliament dissolved not too long ago. All of this is grist for the mill of state making. And what it reflects is a competitive geopolitical environment that encourages the people that have to survive these things going on to create various state capacities that enable them to do that. And so it's like a small ecosystem in which you've got various actors with various skills and advantages and liabilities. Some of them are going to do worse. Some of them are going to do better. And I'm trying to figure out how to explain that process. So there are two models that I'll just very briefly go through. One is that the thing to look for are intermittent shocks coming in from the external environment through warfare, through the death of rulers or the ascent of new rulers, or terminations of rivalries or beginning of new rivalries. Actors have to respond, decision makers have to respond to these things. And there are facilitators that help them to do that if they happen to have access to money, if they have access to allies, if they have good locations. There are obstacles that discourage them from doing it very well, if they have large numbers of alienated minorities, if they have impoverished masses, if they have multiple rivals, if they have bad locations. All of those things are effective in changing the outcomes. In addition, however, these intermittent shocks and facilitators and obstacles take place in a situation in which you've got a quadrilateral of four main considerations. You've got state capabilities, that is, what sort of resources do the states have access to? You've got state capacity, which is really what people usually refer to as state making. And the problem with state making is that everybody in this room has a different definition in their mind about what that might mean. And it's important to commit to some particular conceptualization, and the one that I subscribe to is one that was developed by K.J. Holste back in the 90s that argues that it's a three-factored idea that involves legitimacy, extraction, and the monopoly of force. That's what I will be referring to as state capacity, although I realize that there are other things that go into that particular concept, particularly at different stages in a state's history. The third variable is leadership strategies, and that is how they happen to try and harness ideas that are floating around with their capabilities and capacity to get things done. And then finally, the fourth one is governance, which is problem solving. And as you well know, states have different priorities as to what problems are going to be solved before others are likely to be attacked. Many of them are prioritizing simply staying in power as the main problem to be resolved. But there are, of course, a large range of others. All right, so what do I do in this paper is I try and measure the 8 states in the Gulf in terms of state capacity, and I have data for those 3 sub-variables of extraction, legitimacy, and monopoly of violence. There is a convenient source that the World Bank puts out on governance indicators. They have 6 indicators that they collect on an annual basis or have been doing so for the last 20 years. I use 5 of those 6 in a particular combination. Legitimacy is measured in terms of voice and accountability, and rule of law and anti-corruption indices that are developed through a variety of reputational and hard data assembly of information that they go through. Extraction is very difficult to measure when many of the states do not actually extract the typical taxation resources. So I use government effectiveness for that. And violence monopoly is measured in terms of the absence of violence, which is not quite the same thing, but it's some indicator of how much the government can control or restrain the use of violence by other people in the society. All right, so what you do is you have these indicators on 5 measures, and you can add them together because they're measured same scales. The outcome of this is that you get clustering of states within the Gulf. The UAE and Qatar are at the top, consistently score best on most of the indicators, but in the aggregate do the best. And then you've got a middle group, Bahrain and Oman and Kuwait, that are not only in the middle, but they're also declining in terms of their scores slightly. And you've got below that Saudi Arabia as sort of a flat line from 1996 to 2016 without any change or virtually any change. And then below that, you've got Iran and Iraq. Iraq is at the very bottom and has a long way to go to catch up with the other states. So you've got a distribution of scores that involves some explanatory challenge. Qatar is at the very top. They have a 12-point improvement over the 1996 to 2016 period. Kuwait has almost a similar decline over that same time period. And then the other states are sort of in between that. I won't go through each score. How do you explain this kind of change over time? First of all, I would say that I would much rather have information that would let me go back much farther than 1996. You can imagine for a number of Gulf states, 1970, 71 would be the ideal place to start. But I can't do that just yet, and have to sort of stick with the data that are available. The ways in which people tend to explain these kinds of changes have been threefold. One is a matter of war preparations for war, rivalries, are external pressures that strongly encourage harder states or stronger states. 2 is economic growth, which allows rulers to manipulate those resources for expanding the state. And 3 are the strategies that leaders pursue that are entrepreneurial in terms of expanding the state, as opposed to just simply trying to stay on top of things from day to day. There are a number of wars in the Gulf that are relevant. The way people treat this in international relations in general, it's usually direct participation in warfare, but in the Gulf, indirect participation is probably just as important. That is, if you see a war across the Gulf, you're going to be reacting to it almost as much as if you're actually in the war, or you're worried about whether you have the ability to protect yourself and maybe need new allies as a consequence. Or alternatively, there are instances like blockades or quarantines that have warlike effects in which you put rulers into situations in which they need to exchange something with their populations to provide support to get through the hard times. And so as a consequence, you get more representative institutions sometimes coming out of these kinds of situations. Similarly, wars can be very destructive, and that's why Iraq is at the bottom of the state-making ladder, in the sense that they simply have had their state destroyed, and they're going to have to rebuild it at some future point. So the economic growth and/or economic adversity, which would include, of course, prices of oil fluctuating up and down, lead to an array of data that very closely resembles the array of data on state making. So you get 3 clusters. You get Qatar, UAE, and Kuwait at the very top. That is on the states that are doing the best on economic growth. You get a middle group of Bahrain, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, and this is controlling for population. And then again, Iran and Iraq are at the bottom again. So it's clear that, that there is some relationship between the economic resources that are available and how well people can do in making states, particularly in terms of building bureaucracies. It helps to have the resources for that. It helps to have resources for subsidies to populations that are important in this part of the world. It doesn't guarantee that the state-making process will be problem-free, but it certainly helps avoid some of those problems that come up when you don't have the economic resources to deal with. And I think people are familiar with the restrictions that have come about as a consequence of oil price changes that reflect the changing environment in that regard. Finally, you get to leadership strategies. That's where the human agency comes in. That's also the most difficult to assess. We know what the end of the continuums look like, so that you've got Saddam Hussein at one end. It's pretty easy to blame him for some of Iraq's problems, perhaps not all of them, but some of them. That's human agency at work, just as people often give both Qatar and UAE a great deal of credit in terms of the particular ruling families that have been involved in generating their leadership on these state-making attributes, in the sense that the rulers have explicitly attempted to expand and build their states, as opposed to not doing that or worrying about other things. But here the problem is, if you're trying to do this in a comparative sense and not just tell stories about it, it's very difficult to figure out what the right variables are to assess. Is it a matter of ruthlessness? Is it a matter of luck? Is it a matter of stability and longevity? Is it a matter of innovation? Is it a matter of having a reform agenda? All of those things seem to fit into which ones work better than others, but we can't measure them all. And personally, I have no solution to how to deal with human agency at this particular point. It's much easier to deal with wars and economic growth, which are fairly easy to measure. So the conclusion that I have in this paper is an interim conclusion, which is to say that I'm reluctant to make many generalizations, in part because the number of data points are so few. The homogeneity of the Gulf states is too great. And one way to do this is to bring in more states to compare the Gulf to. But there's also some problem in pinning down some of the conceptualization and variables that are involved. I think at the same time, it's fairly easy to see that all three of the general explanations that are applied outside of the Gulf probably fit the Gulf fairly well. And whether or not you need more for local conditions remains to be seen. But I think if I was forced to come away with a takeaway, a quick takeaway, I would say that it's a matter of external stimuli driving these processes, that is the threats and problems that states face coming in from outside their boundaries, that are filtered by how much wealth they have to deal with those problems, and always contingent on how active leaders are in coming up with the right solutions. And I'll stop at that point.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You have saved a lot of time, which gives us a good opportunity for discussion later on. So for the second paper that we have Imad Mansour. Imad بيتكلم عن أثر التنافس في بناء الدول الخليجية.
Next we have Imad Mansour. He will be talking. He is assistant professor of international affairs at Qatar University, and he has a book about the art of governance in the Middle East. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Arab Center and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. After all, we are in the last session, and I would like to apologize because I want to speak in English, and I hope this will not be.
Thank you again for coming to the last talk. While really thinking about the topic or the project that's being really germinated now, and what I'm really presenting on, I started really looking at how state-making in the Gulf has been generally explained. So the tendency is to look back at the role of individuals as leaders, is to look at the abundance of resources as really triggering and also influencing the process of state-making, and also fear of dominating regional powers or fear of the hegemony of regional big actors. So GCC states have, since their independence, been trying to build up the institutional capacity and build up also the identity of the states. So I'm interested really in thinking about how has this been done. Now, so with the understanding that all the factors that I stated, so the role of leaders, money, and fear of regional real hegemony, have intersected with the fact that we often hear from GCC discourses that discord is not good. ليس خصال حميدة. We should try to move really beyond discord and fighting that we have and focus on the similarities to build up our states. But at the same time, GCC states fight among themselves. They have their rivalries, they have their competitions, they withdraw ambassadors, they're really part of tiffs and arguments and all that. So that was the first thing I was really thinking of when I'm thinking of the project of how do we think about state building in the Gulf or in the GCC. The second really factor that's of interest is the fact that since independence, those really modern states have been trying to also move away or to create a niche for themselves as Westphalian states that are not really fully derivative of the tribal and the familiar heritage that they have. So they've tried to emphasize their tribal and family really backgrounds, but they've also tried to say that we are independent institutionally in terms of identity. So in building the state, they've tried to create a certain sense of Qatar is different than Bahrain, than Saudi Arabia. So now the intervention that I would like to try to make here, or the idea that I would like to share with you, is the fact that I'm making two interlocked arguments, or an argument that has two folds. One is that the way that competition has been resolved between those states has been hardening state institutions. So it's actually contributing to the Westphalianization of the state in the Gulf. So the way that they resolved the conflicts and the competitions and the crisis is actually helping them build up the states. The second really related argument is that the way that, again, those crises and conflicts have unfolded, it's actually given more political capital and credibility to the idea of the state over and above the tribe. And I'll explain why this is important. Now, I'm not saying that the crises and the conflicts are strategically deployed, meaning they did not create them. And I'm not really talking about a teleological process for the state, that it's moving to be something we think it should be. I'm just trying to see how state building has moved in the Gulf. And can we then, at a later stage, compare the process of state building to others internationally? In Europe, maybe, North America, South Asia, or is there something distinct about the Gulf? So, in thinking about the importance of the tribe and importance of the state, a few things really stand out. One, tribes like to move. Now, this is not about constant movement. Over time, a lot of sedentary building of cities have happened. Oman, Hatem, other cases of rooted really existence, but tribes have tended historically to move in search of water or others. And in the Gulf or in the GCC, I think that there's a sense that we are not really limited by borders, that something about the family attachment, the history of movement in the region makes us think of tribes as naturally belonging in the Gulf, Jazira al-Arabiya, not a state, a confined locale. The second thing I was really thinking about is there is a process of conflict resolution in tribal or within tribal really logics. الدخول الحماية في الحرم, all those really processes that belong to certain very indigenous forms of conflict resolution. So the tribe has really something to offer in terms of international relations, meaning wanting to move, into how conflicts are being resolved. Now, when I'm thinking about the tribe, I understand that the tribe has effectively not been a challenger to the political processes of GCC states. And at times that it has tried, the cost has been very high on tribes. So they've not really challenged the authority of the state. I think what the tribe poses to the Westphalian state is that its legitimacy, it's socioculturally a legitimate entity, and it's an active political organization. So the fact that it offers an alternate form of political organization is maybe threatening or disheartening or a bit unsettling for the logic of the Westphalian state. So the fact that there's a sub-state entity that can legitimately appropriate and can organize people around it is a bit unsettling to the state in the Gulf. This duality is what I would like to see, try to think about how it's playing out in crisis and conflicts and competitions. Over time, a lot of the states have tried to entrench the legitimacy of the state with reference, as I said, to the history of tribal existence. And that inherently forms tension in the project of the state, in the project of the Westphalian state. Because tribes are mobile, they don't necessarily want to abide by the confining feature of the borders, yet they do, yet they have to. So how is this tension playing out? How is it really played out? And how do we see moments, which is my argument here, where the state has actually had more to say in setting the agenda than the tribe? States like to spatialize themselves. They want to live in a territory know what the borders are, control access in and out, have the right over who has the passport, who has not, who can move in and out. This is the logic of the state. This is at least the logic of the Westphalian state as we know it now. As I said a minute ago, tribes don't really believe in this limited spatializations. They have a broader understanding of movement. So the statutory logic would not understand movement and mobility in the ways that the population of the GCCs maybe see as given, as the right to move. And here's one maybe example as to why the conflict and the crisis and the competitions are actually helping the state. So when you close down the borders, as what happened in June, 2017, I think, and if I'm not really mistaken in my interpretation, you actually allow the idea that this is a formalized border to entrench itself, to be somewhat ingrained in the minds of people. That actually, even by the states, they are imposing this control on Qatar. They're actually making more clear that those are the borders that we seek to protect. It's really signaling to the citizens, to the tribes, to itself, that this is our space. So we've spatialized ourselves via instituting this crisis on Qatar. And we've made maybe really final what we think are the borders of our states and what other states or what other people from other states can do in our state, meaning can they enter or not? And what do they need? Do they need our approval? Is it enough that they are from the Gulf? So I think that some outcome of the crisis is to entrench this sense of the finality and the speciality of the states. So the ideas of borders, which is, maybe we can see it in the no border, only horizons of Qatar Airways, right? So we don't have any borders. We have the right to fly, to move. The idea is that there are no borders, yet the crisis or the embargo ended up doing exactly that, instituting this certain physical limitation. The second point that I think has been interesting is the fact, maybe again I'm really mistaken in this, but I don't think so, is that many societies in the Gulf and the polities seem to still have a problem in a lot of structures of societies. People with ancestries, say, from Iran, people with ancestries from the slave trade, working in pearl really diving. There seems to be a bit more, less really consensus on who constitutes a citizen and why. And how does this relate to the form of authority, which is the state? And I think that during moments of crisis, and maybe the last we saw in the embargo on Qatar, we find the identification with Qabilati Qatar. We find people wanting to make a space out of themselves in identifying with the flag of the state, with the shape of the state, maybe with the emir of the state. So it sort of had or allowed people to cut across those cleavages and divisions to figure out certain commonalities to their identification. In that sense, I think that the crisis or the embargo in Qatar helped maybe Qatar in a certain way to have a collective, clearer understanding of itself and people to identify with each other as equals, more or less. I should emphasize here that the interest that I'm trying to highlight is the fact that there exists other forms of political organization than the state and the tribe, again, which is why they pose a challenge to the state. Three instances that I'm going to try to highlight and maybe really conclude with help us understand this influence of competition on state building. So I've mentioned a few examples. One of the three that I'm going to focus is about how territoriality has been pursued and entrenched over time. And one example has been the territorial competition between Qatar and Bahrain over Zubara, over Hawar, and how that has been resolved. It was finally resolved in 2001. At the time, the Emir said that, well, we would, or really in previous years, the Emir of Qatar said we were going to go to the international court, we will try, or we will go to international institutions, this is what states do. We're going to accept whatever arbitration comes out, and we have faith in international norms and values to help us figure out, the territory. And this is exactly what happened. So the outcome was, in the discourse of the Emir then, maybe not fully favorable, but we're going to accept it as a sovereign state that is really living in a field of other sovereign states. So one way that we see this entrenchment of Westphalianism is accepting international arbitration and going to international institutions to solve issues with neighbors. A second really example about this, maybe related also to borders and to international arbitration, is the withdrawal of passports. So withdrawal of passports is some kind of a practice that we see often happening. I think that's also helped to entrench the sovereignty of the state and the stateness of those entities. Now, in the process of revoking your citizenship, no one is thrown in jail because they did something wrong, but because they don't have a passport or they don't have citizenship. So the issue here doesn't really become the criminality of individuals, but how much do they play by or have the right of access to internationally recognized documents. So again, this I think helps a state like Qatar and others say that we are we are being part of international norms and practices, and one way that we're really doing that is by enforcing our political authority really domestically, but we do that within the contours of international norms and regulations. So going to international arbitration and also using or playing in domestic really politics according to ways and rules that are recognized internationally. Sovereignty in foreign policy is the other issue that needs maybe to be attended to. What we've seen in the chasm that really was created after the onset of the 2011 Arab Spring is many distinctions among GCC states. With Qatar, the beef in 2013-14 was support for the Muslim Brotherhood, support of actors, and then we know the rest of the story. The dispute in 2014, as well as the one that's ongoing also today, really signified, from Qatar's perspective, a great opportunity to demonstrate its foreign policy independence. That as a sovereign really state in the Gulf, we have the right, or within the members of the GCC, we have the right to take independent foreign policy actions. States all over the world really do that, and why should we not? So then we see this group of states that came together in the first place because of certain sociocultural proximities, common values, and common also strategic interests. We see them at this moment of crisis or tension. One of them, at least, is trying to emphasize its sovereignty as an independent state. It's trying to make really references to Westphalian norms of sovereignty and independence to say that this is my right really to do that, I should be doing that over and above other rules that tie me to members of the GCC. So the rules of family, tribe, loyalty, religion, being part of the Gulf, Khalijuna Wahid, we have the right as Qatar, as a sovereign state, to do that, to pursue foreign policy independence. And the last point is, again, so it really wraps up and it emphasizes its appeal to international norms and practices. So in the 20s, in the embargo that was placed on Qatar starting in June 2017, all the states in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates all deployed Westphalian values and institutions, such as going to the United Nations to complain about human rights violations, financing of terrorism. So those things were done by the offending states and the defending state. So the states that attacked, Qatar said, oh, look, we have news from this organization, from this international norm, from this, that Qatar is doing this and this and that. So Qatar is violating international norms according to the embargo states. The reaction by Qatar has been, well, but all the groups that you mentioned that are financing real terrorism are really recognized by, as international humanitarian organizations. So they also came back to international law and international norms to counter the arguments against the embargo states. So in this really duality, we observe that the reference of the member states, both of them, the Quartet and Qatar, has been how we are actually playing by international norms and values. Those are things we don't want to violate. So this reads really to me as an attempt to try to entrench the sovereignty of the state, or it helps at least to entrench the state as following internationally recognized norms and regulations. So, in conclusion, I think that the state building in the Gulf or in the GCC needs to be analyzed a bit more in terms of how have the conflicts and the crises being have been impacting it, and thus in the future maybe develop a clearer understanding of how the project of state making in the GCC have been really developing, and we are in the midst of a big really transformation, so we can't really forecast, but at least from so far we can tell that the authority of the state as a Westphalian state, I think, has become much clearer over other forms of social attachments, the tribe and the logic of the tribe, and at the same time the identity or the presence of the state as independent really Westphalian states have been really proven to be strengthened by these conflicts and crises and rivalries between GCC states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Imad, when it comes for respecting your allocated time, and the last paper, and it's our final paper for today, and it is titled, we have an interesting presentation, and it talks about the situating the Gulf and the changing dynamics in the Indian Ocean region, and the professor is visiting professor in many Chinese universities, and also Professor Niblock, are you ready? Almost ready.
Just getting this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. I should say that Professor Badi, when he began, said that Anglo-Saxons like to give lectures standing up, whereas French people like to give them sitting down. So I'm carefully observing his stereotype. So I'm going to stand up.
I appreciate it's very difficult for you to hold on, especially it's the last session.
Actually, I can start speaking even while they're working that out, because I don't need that at the very beginning. So I'm very pleased to be here again. I think these forums are always very useful and very valuable. I'm also actually pleased that my paper is the last paper in the formal sessions. And the reason for that is that I'd like to make a link with how this conference began. Remember, we began with Professor Badi, and he was talking about how the current differences and conflicts around the Gulf take on a new and different dimension, a different kind of significance when placed within the wider context of regional and global politics. And that is the same theme that I want to pursue in this final session. My concern is with the wider dimension, the regional and global dimension. And specifically, I want to focus on the Indian Ocean region, which I believe is, on the one hand, the most critically important region for the Gulf's own interests, but also is a critical fulcrum in the new international order. an area where one can see very clearly, I think, the emergence of the new major powers, China and India in particular, how that is changing the dynamics of the established global order. New stresses coming from that, new dimensions of conflict, no doubt, but also new possibilities of cooperation. So let me now try to explain or justify the statements I've just made. Why is it crucial to the Gulf? Why is that region critical to the Gulf? Well, that is the easiest part, I think, to answer, and it's fairly clear. And one can see it from economic statistics. Every year I look at the IMF statistics, direction of trade statistics, which come out in May of every year, and I work out where trade is going from the Gulf. I've done that for a number of years now, and I did it this year, and so have the figures now for 2016. And every year one has seen steadily the amount of trade, the amount of Gulf exports going to the, going out of the Gulf, going in an eastward direction, that percentage growing every year bit by bit. And I'm focusing in particular on exports, because as far as the Gulf is concerned, it is actually the Gulf, the exports which are important, the exports of oil and gas and petrochemicals, because those are all things which really you need to go out by sea from the Gulf. Imports, it's a bit different. You can bring a lot of imports in by air or by road in the case of the Gulf. And Qatar, of course, has found out how useful it is to be able to bring things in by air in recent times. So it's the exports which are important. And if you look at the major markets for Gulf oil, by Gulf, by the way, I'm talking about all 8 states of the Gulf taken together. If you look at the major markets for Gulf exports, if you take the top 14, all of the markets to which at least $4 billion worth of exports go from the 8 countries together of the Gulf, you find that in 2016, the proportion going eastwards across the Gulf to basically Asia, from the Indian subcontinent eastwards to China and Japan, was about 76% of all of the exports to the major markets. And so if, on the other hand, you add together all of the exports going to Europe and to North America and to Africa, for that matter, if you add them all together, it only comes to about 24%. And that figure of 76% going eastwards to Asia from the Indian subcontinent through to Japan, Korea, I mean, that is the highest figure so far. Every year it creeps up a bit further, and the process of creeping up will almost certainly continue. So a lot of that pattern is already known in general terms, although the extent of it and the speed with which this happens is not always recognized. So let me now go on to the other part of this. Why is the strategic dimension of the Indian Ocean particularly important now? And it is because the distribution of power and interest in the region is changing. And the strategies which are being pursued by major powers, the new major powers especially which are emerging, are creating new balances, new possibilities of conflict, and new opportunities for cooperation. And I'm going to show now some statistics relating to defense and the size of armies and navies in particular of those powers which are involved in the Indian Ocean in a major way. I should say that I get a bit nervous about putting these figures forward or putting these views forward because I'm not a defense specialist. I'm a fairly innocent political scientist. And I know there are people in the conference who have got a lot of military specialization. In my defense, I would say that at least the statistics which I'm using are ones which have come from the Military Balance 2017, produced by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And those figures produced annually, are, I think, usually regarded as at least among the 2 to 3 authoritative defense sets of defense statistics. So I hope I'm on fairly secure ground there. So let me start. Going up like that, are we? Okay. Looking at the strengths of the major naval powers globally. Now, when you look at that, to begin with, if you look down personnel, you see the numbers of personnel. United States on top, but China not far behind. However, the critical figures there are, well, for example, aircraft carriers, United States 10, and that way ahead of others. And those figures in themselves are significant, but of course it's much more significant if you think of the kind of technology involved, the size of the aircraft carriers, much greater in the case of the United States than any other aircraft carriers, the number of aircraft which can be carried, and so on and so forth. So it looks fairly clear from that the United States is still by far the major naval power. And you can tell that as well from, let's go on now, the overall defense expenditure. Navies, after all, operate within the wider framework of defense expenditure. Their strength depends partly on the size of the army and such like, and the air force. So one does need to look at the whole picture of the defense expenditure. And again, one sees the strong position of the United States, 4 times more than China, more than 10 times the UK, India, and such like. And again, bear in mind the technological strength as well, generally in advance of others. It is interesting to note that the largest armed forces in the world, active armed forces, are China's. And in fact, the largest armed forces, including reservists, is India. But numbers isn't everything. If one goes on to table 3, one begins to think of different kinds of patterns. The rate of increase of defense expenditure between 2007 and 2016, over that period, one sees China, Russia, and India increasing their expenditure on defense very much. The United States and the UK reducing their defense expenditure. France also, if you take the most recent period in France, you'd also find that going down, although over that period it comes out in positively. So there is some change on that. But nonetheless, the conclusion which seems to follow from what I've said so far is that the strategic balance in the Gulf hasn't changed all that significantly. The same situation as before, where there was no doubting either the primacy of the United States in its ability to control the security agenda in the Indian Ocean, nor the relative insignificance of other naval powers. That would seem to be the immediate conclusion, but I would suggest to you that that is the wrong conclusion to draw. It is incorrect, because in fact things have changed, and they are changing. And I would contend that actually everything has changed, or at least is changing. And the major change is that other powers, other naval powers, and especially Asian powers, now see a role for themselves in projecting their power into and across the Indian Ocean in a way which they didn't before. And to a greater or lesser extent, these powers have a narrower focus in their security concern than does the United States. The United States, after all, has global military and security concerns, plenty of concerns in other parts of the world besides the Indian Ocean. At the moment, considerable interest in what's happening in Northeast Europe, for example. India tends to focus almost exclusively in naval security terms on the Indian Ocean. China, of course, has a focus on the East and South China Seas, but now increasingly is looking into the Indian Ocean. And I'll make a few more comments about other powers in a moment, but just to go forward with that, if you look at China and India, in the case of China, China's intention of being able to project naval power outside of its own vicinity is usually traced back to statements made by President Hu Jintao in December 2006, laying down a plan for the modernization and strengthening of the country's naval forces. And today, probably the most significant white paper from the Chinese government is a 2015 white paper where you find a statement, the PLA Navy will gradually shift its focus from offshore waters defense to a combination of offshore waters defense with open seas protection, and on building a combined multifunctional and efficient marine combat force structure. And that came at about the same time as a blue paper was issued on the Indian Ocean. So the importance of the Indian Ocean was brought out there. And of course, since 2013, there has been the One Belt, One Road, and especially the Maritime Silk Road, building up facilities, economic mainly, around the Indian Ocean and stretching out the reach of China into the Indian Ocean. As far as India is concerned, well, it's been evident at least since 2004, although India has a longer history in terms of having an aircraft carrier, two aircraft carriers. 2007, the Maritime Capability Perspective Plan moves things forward, and in 2015, the document Ensure Secure Seas, Indian Maritime Security Strategy. And that makes it, I think, very clear the wide scope of India's security interests in the Indian Ocean and its economic interests and needs in the region, and the naval presence needed to defend India's interests. So you have those two countries, but also bear in mind Japan. Now, Japan has actually a very strong navy, which it calls the Maritime Self-Defense Force. At present, of course, it has been limited to self-defense activities by Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Its 3 aircraft carriers have a lot of technology with them, but they're described as helicopter destroyers. Now, following the victory of the Liberal Democratic Komeito coalition in the Japanese elections last month, there is the possibility that Article 9 of the Constitution may be revised so as to enable a wider projection of power. I think actually it's too early to think of that being exercised very much in the Indian Ocean, but one is sort of moving in that kind of direction. And one can also say some things about more active roles being played by the British, the French, and the Russian navies in the Indian Ocean. Significant, perhaps, but not so crucial in changing the established pattern of interaction. So overall, one has a wider range of countries which could play and may be intent on playing a bigger role in the Indian Ocean than before. And in that kind of situation, very important, I think, in global developments at the moment, you, of course, have new possibilities of conflict, and you also have new possibilities of cooperation, which should not be forgotten. Do I have another 3 or 4 minutes, Chairman? Yeah. Fine. And I think now it's worth going back to Professor Badi's points at the beginning of the conference, that one should not think only in terms of power, only in terms of alliance and conflict, but one should also think about other dimensions, especially possibilities for integration and cooperation. The power game is not the only game in town, even though sometimes in Western discourse it sounds as if it is. It's interesting that already in the Gulf you have frameworks of cooperation. You have the Indian-based Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, formed in 1997 to promote sustainable growth and balanced development in the coastal states of the Indian Ocean. And as far as China is concerned, the Maritime Silk Road is not just something intended to promote trade with China. It's set within a context where the Indian Ocean and the routes on the way to the Indian Ocean are conceived of as an attempt to create integration, a zone of integration and cooperation among the states. In my view, what is needed is that these two frameworks are, in some cases, in some way articulated together. I don't mean that they can form the same thing, but at any rate, placed within a context in which cooperative relations can exist among all of those states concerned. China and India, it should be remembered, although it's often they're spoken of often as if they're bound to get into conflict, but China and India have a very strong common interest in stability and security in the Indian Ocean. They both depend crucially on peaceful sea lanes which are secure and which they can rely on. Is this still working, by the way? Sometimes there's a light which goes on and sometimes not. It's working, fine, okay. Disruption would be harmful to both. Now, how does the what has happened here?
Press any key to activate it. No, it's okay.
Okay, it's all right. Yeah, fine. How does the Gulf fit into this? Well, that is the naval power of the Gulf. The strongest navy of the GCC states is Saudi Arabia. I don't really have time to discuss what these figures mean too much. Now, yes, you can look at the size of the Navy. You may be impressed by the number of submarines, but you need to bear in mind that 17 of those submarines are midget submarines, which are operated by either one or two people only. Three of the remaining ones are described as coastal submarines, and only one fits into the category of a so-called attack submarine. And one can say some other things to qualify these figures, but what comes out of all of this is that even the strongest navy of the GCC or Iran, they fit into the bracket of middle-sized naval powers within the Indian Ocean, perhaps rather similar to Malaysia and Bangladesh, less strong than the navies of Thailand or Pakistan or Indonesia or Australia, and certainly, of course, India is in a different category, and a bit stronger than the navies of Kenya and Tanzania. Now, let me try and sum up from this and conclude what comes out of it. The GCC is not in a position where it can be a lead actor strategically in the Indian Ocean. But the countries of the Gulf as a whole, indeed, their policy towards the Indian Ocean can nonetheless be important. And it seems to me that there are two different kinds of strategy which can be pursued, one of which I think is not very good, and the other which I think is good. The first one is to work within the framework of power politics. In other words, to take up an alignment with external powers, whether Western powers or Asian powers, and work with one or other or a grouping of them to secure their security, perhaps against other major powers. And it seems to me that that strategy, whether the outside powers are Western or Asian, is very dangerous. It's a strategy which could intensify divisions within the Gulf if Gulf states take up different protectors from outside, as has often happened in the past. And it could also feed back into any conflicts in the Indian Ocean, and it should be avoided. The other option is to work with other middle-sized powers around the Indian Ocean to promote cooperative and integrative frameworks in the region, in the Indian Ocean region, the kinds of frameworks which I mentioned a moment ago. Asian and African countries need to be involved in this generally, not just the coastal countries, but also those critically dependent on trade routes, Japan, South Korea, China, of course. It sounds from this as if I'm trying to exclude the United States and European countries from the picture. Well, I'm not doing that deliberately, but the reality is that economic interest is something which can provide the basis for very effective cooperation among these countries, because all of them have a degree of dependence on each other and on the Gulf, which does not apply now nearly so much, I think, to the United States or European countries. And on that note, and I'm sorry, I have gone over for a few minutes, I will stop.
Thank you, Professor Hatem Niblock, for his interesting presentation on the Indian Ocean. I remind you of the names. We have 20 minutes left I say to the panelists, we have 20 minutes left for this session. If you have any energy left, we'll take a few questions. Then, if we have time, we'll have a second round. We'll start right from the back there.
Thank you. Gert Nonneman from Georgetown University in Qatar. A question to Tim. I take it from your last couple of sentences that you're not intending this as a piece of advice to step away from a reliance on security provision by, say, the US and perhaps UK and France, but add to the complementary security relationships. Which, if that's the case, that would fit beautifully within the security strategies, I think, of all of these Gulf states, particularly the smaller ones, I mean, including Saudi Arabia, the GCC states for the past 100 years. That combination of finding a major, overwhelmingly important external protector and then having these complementary relationships. Because if that's not what you're suggesting, I would imagine that a country like Qatar would be very concerned at dropping this hegemonic external protector as part of its package, because clearly it's the US presence, both militarily here, and its important relationship linkages with Qatar, as represented in the circles of the power, the corridors of power in Washington, that arguably have safeguarded Qatar's independence on this occasion.
Thanks. Can we take another one or two questions before we? Yeah, there is a question here.
I have a question to Mr. Timothy. There was a time when the region you're referring to was described as Asia-Pacific region, and seems there was no controversy over that. So what we've seen in recent time, and especially Trump administration, is going ahead with that present to reshape it and to use another terminology instead of Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. And it seems that this is not about wording, this is not about terminology, because Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific reflects two conflicting, contradictory concepts of the future of the vast region. And in fact, in Russia, in China, political pundits and politicians are not subscribing to the concept of Indo-Pacific, insisting that it should be Asia-Pacific, smelling a rat in the whole thing of Indo-Pacific, saying that this is against China. And this is an attempt to build a new alliance between the United States and India, and to encircle China with a belt of anti-Chinese states. You know, you are well aware that China, on its part, is cutting corners to reinstate its leadership in the vast region, despite it has full plate of problems with ASEAN countries. So my question is, where are you in this dispute between the followers Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific, and what new challenges this controversy poses to Gulf countries? Thank you.
بروفيسور أنتوني وبعدين دكتور سيف بعده حد هنا دكتور جون.
Thank you. I would like to introduce several things and ask the panelists if they might comment, both as to their relevance or irrelevance. One, ports in all of this, and port expansion and port deepening. Qatar, for example, has just finished an enormous expansion of its port, which allows it to take far larger ships than ever before. Two, tourism. You mentioned about economic interest here, worthy of protection there. Qatar alone, between now and April, has 23 contracted ships with 500 passengers on each coming here. They leave the ship in the morning, they come back in the evening, having spent money in the markets and the host countries. Dubai is one of those, Oman is one of those, Bahrain is one of those there. Point three is Russia is not mentioned. Ever since Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, they've been looking for a warm water port. They have one perhaps in Latakia too, in western shore of Syria. but they are expanding their routes, their capacities in the Indian Ocean. What are the implications of that? And lastly, Bahrain is a tiny country, but ever since 1948, the United States has set anchor there just about every day. And it's not just Bahrain, it protects the Fifth Fleet, the entire western side of the Gulf, or the entire coastal strip of eastern Arabia from Kuwait to Oman. If you find any of these factors that weren't addressed relevant, might you please indicate their relevance? Thank you.
شكرا جون. ممكن الميكروفون للأمام دكتور سيف.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
The name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. William mentioned 3 incentives for state-making, political leadership, wars, and resources and economic factor. So far as the Gulf countries are concerned, and in light of the fall in the oil prices and also the states lifting economic support and subsidies, how would all of this impact the efforts to, so far as state building and state making is concerned, and how will this impact societies and peoples of these countries, and to what extent can they have a say in the running of their countries? Also, my other question is, in view of the current crisis, which countries are likely to consolidate their independence and sovereignty? This is on the one side. On the other, if this is a question to Imad, if these conflicts and the conflict settlement contributes to the independence and sovereignty of the Gulf countries, now we see another trend. We see more and more expat workers coming, and the demographic makeup of our countries are changing. How will this impact the situation? Last question in this round, please. I have 2 questions. My first question is to Dr. Imad. You alluded to the tribe and its role here in the Gulf. Despite all this modernization and civilization currently seen in the Gulf and the human resource development, these are very positive signs, yet the tribe still has a role to play, in fact, a major role to play. I lived in Kuwait for some time, and I remember the tribal dimension is very prominent in the elections in Kuwait, and some people are elected completely because of their tribal affiliations. And my second question to my mentor and teacher, Professor Tim Niblock, please make your question very short.
Yeah, my question, there is a lot of activities going on the southern part of the Red Sea, building of bases by China, by France, by Emirates, by a number of countries. So could you link that interest of building these bases with regard to the Indian Oceans? And also, sorry, Annie, the Russians were, during the 1970s, were working very hard to get to warm and hot waters in the Indian Oceans. Compared to the development now by China and the United States and so on, Russia is very back. Why is that, do you think? Thank you.
بنبدأ بالإجابة من البروفيسور نيبلوك.
We will start with Professor Niblock and then Professor Thompson, then Imad.
Okay, thank you for those questions, all of which are important and are the kind of questions which I thought might arise. I think of them, one of the questioners will be pleased by my answer now, and maybe two of the others might not be so pleased. So let me start with the one about the Indo-Pacific and the Asian Pacific. No, I am looking at things, I see things from the point of view of Asia-Pacific. And that was why I was trying to put emphasis on China as well as India. I try to emphasize them both because, you know, at the moment I spend a lot of my time in China. I know the Chinese position very well. I talk to people on defense in China and whatever. And, you know, I tend as a whole to share their viewpoints. But in presenting this, I wouldn't like to, and indeed, I think one of the weaknesses on the Chinese side is that they don't take India fully into account, which I think they should. And so you know, I do try to get that balance a bit right. And then Gert's question, which I think was very well expressed. So Gert asked whether, you know, I was suggesting that Gulf states should step away from Western alliances, suggesting that that would not be the right thing to do. But I am suggesting that. I'm not saying that they should abandon them. But I think one is moving into a new kind of situation where the dangers of one Gulf state being backed by one particular external power, which has, of course, always been a problem in the past in terms of intensifying division within the region. But I think that kind of danger is even greater now than before. I mean, I'm an idealist, and I would accept that at the moment many of my perspectives are rather difficult to sort of envisage within the region. But I do believe in creating some kind of security community in the Gulf, including all 8 countries of the Gulf. And that will involve, I think, a reduced external presence. But I'm an idealist. And about the ports and dependency, Bahrain and such like, Russia not being mentioned. I think that what's happening with the ports is very interesting and very important. It's also worth bearing in mind that the ports in East Africa are being developed in a very major way. And in fact, there is quite a lot of trade in the future, I think, which will go straight across the Indian Ocean without coming to the Gulf for sort of repackaging, so to speak. Russia's role today is, of course, much different from back in the 1980s or 1970s and 80s. Nonetheless, Russia in the 1990s, its naval power fell apart very much. But in the last 10 years, especially, it has built itself up again. But I think the Indian Ocean probably will not be at the forefront of the Russian Navy's concerns. And the bases taking place around the bottom of the Red Sea, Djibouti in particular, but also Berbera, Assab, and so on, I think they're important. It's significant, of course, that China has a facility, as it calls it, in Djibouti. It wouldn't call it a base. And all kinds of facilities and bases seem to be developing in Djibouti. And I suppose that's a symbol of the fact that the Indian Ocean is going into a new phase. that that it's evidence that major powers are now thinking of projecting their power, or new major powers are thinking of projecting their power in a way in which they didn't before.
Professor Thompson.
So I take it the question is, what should we anticipate given economic deterioration? If economic growth is one of the three main sources of state making or encouraging state making, then economic deterioration should work against successful state making. But there is a caveat to that, and that's that it's not just a matter of external stimuli and environmental conditions. There are people involved that are making deals. Rulers need support from their populations. And if they're not able to provide one kind of exchange, then they may have to provide other kinds of exchange. So historically, representative institutions have grown out of stressful situations in which rulers could not provide anything but some participation in decision-making, or at least the mythology of participating in decision-making. So it's conceivable that it could lead to different kinds of political sharing of power way down the road, not necessarily quickly, but slowly. But still, overall, it remains open-ended, I think, what you might anticipate. Of the cast of characters in the Gulf, that should favor small, wealthy states over large, not so wealthy states for that, in that kind of situation.
There's another question.
Not for me. It was for Imad.
شكرا. سوف أرد الآن باللغة العربية لو سمحت.
Thank you. I will be
السؤال الأول
responding
حول
in
الفرق بين
Arabic.
الوافدين والمواطنين
The question pertaining to the difference between citizens and the expat community. Any social contract should treat everybody on equal footing, and in the mechanisms of state making, some maybe sections of society will be left out. The question is, who will they be, and to what extent will they be excluded from any social contract? The expat community in the Gulf are not part of the political scene in the Gulf, and this is how the social contract has always been and how the societies have been built, and the expat communities should not expect anything like being naturalized or awarded passports or anything of the sort. Will they also be excluded from state making? Politically speaking, yes, but practically and realistically, no, because what is happening now, for example, the state of Qatar, there was an attempt made to improve the lot and the conditions of the expat community, but the crisis really expedited this project. This was not new because of the crisis. It was present for some time, but the crisis stimulated the state of Qatar to be more clear in dealing with the expat community and the residents in the country. And this is the argument I was trying to make, that these kind of conflicts help these countries to engage more or implementing more international norms, and despite the question about the role of the tribe still there, despite the political advancements. I'm sorry, I may have not explained myself clearly. I did not exclude the tribe completely. The tribe is still an actor, and people knowing their line of descendants and lineage and origins, etc. This is one of the norms. Khaldun al-Naqib, Ali Shawi, Gardner gave us details on as to why the tribe remains as very active, partly because the tribe has moved to become part of the political structure and the state also. And here, this tension between the principle of the Westphalian state, internationally known, and all citizens should be at an equal distance or the same distance from government institutions. Some states, of course, sometimes favor some sections against others, but I think the tribal presence will continue, and the solution will be to shape and formulate policies which give a new concept or understanding for citizens. I think this is the perfect time to stop. Now it's 4:30. It's been a long day for most of us. I thank you for your perseverance. I thank the panelists, of course, and you, ladies and gentlemen, and we thank the Arab Center for hosting this event. And until we see you on future occasions, thank you.